Hello and welcome to CBSR's webinar on the best for 2018, a first look at the sustainability reporting trends and best practices from the past year. I'm your host, Leo Rothschild, Executive Director of Canadian Business for Social Responsibility, or CBSR. I'm delighted to be joined by two wonderful guests that I'm excited to introduce to you. But just before I do, let me go over some housekeeping for today's webinar speakers. If you have questions at any point during this webinar, please write them in the chat box and we'll do our very best to address all of them. Afterward, a video of this webinar will be made available on our website, cbsr.ca. And while you're there, take a look at the other videos in our webinar series on sustainable procurement and green bonds. For those of you that tune into these webinars, we like to provide sneak peeks at things to come. So allow me to tell you a bit about the new national campaign we're about to launch, as well as the upcoming webinar in December. Also, consider this your sneak peek or sneak preview at the new CBSR logo in the top left corner there, which the Works, Wes's design company here designed for us. Many of you are already familiar with CBSR, so I won't spend too much time talking about it, but just as a reminder to say that CBSR is a 23-year-old network of 20,000 professionals and influencers, and we work closely with 20 company members on custom programs that support deeper integration of sustainability and corporate responsibility programs, collaboration across many sectors in Canada, and communication of environmental, social, and governance performance using digital media and other communications tools. CBSR is just putting the final touches on a new multimedia and public engagement campaign called Do Business Like a Canadian. This, you can see some of our major campaign sponsors represented at the bottom of this slide. And we're so delighted to be working with such leading brands on a unique project like this. I'd like to share with you one of the major reasons they were motivated to sign on and the rationale for this campaign generally. And maybe I'll just make sure that you can see the full screen here. Okay. While 95% of Canadian exports are dependent on an economy moving further toward nativism, several disconnected movements are stirring in Canada. Some of these movements are focused on securing market access for the resources that have driven the Canadian economy for generations. Others are clamoring for greater investment into a knowledge economy that harnesses new disruptive innovation. And all this is taking place while the clock is ticking on our ability to meaningfully contribute toward the global agenda for a world where economic growth is decoupled from environmental impacts and no one is left behind. Around the world, Canada is known as a fair-minded middle power with good governance. Applying this approach to business is a natural next step. By promoting a national set of Canadian business values, like the ones you see on the screen here, and creating a new platform for public engagement, we can penetrate the mainstream discourse and position a values-driven, sustainable, and inclusive economic development strategy as a competitive advantage and simply the modern way Canadian business is done. Next month, we'll be soft launching the Do Business Like Canadian website and share insider news about exclusive events and keynote speakers, as well as exciting opportunities for you to play an active part in this campaign, plus all the many benefits for you to do so. There's so much here that it warrants its own standalone webinar, which will take place on December 11th. So I hope you'll join us for that. If you're signed up to our newsletter, you'll see more on this soon, but you can also sign up straight from our website at cbsr.ca. Now, it now brings me great pleasure to introduce our two remarkable speakers to you. They are Michael Torrence and Wes Gee. And let me tell you a little bit about them. Michael Torrence is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Associate General Counsel at BMO Financial Group, where he leads the company's environmental, social, and governance strategy and implementation. He's been there for nearly a year, and prior to that, he was a partner at Norton Rose Fulbright LLP, where he spent more than 11 years, specialized in risk advisory on international standards of environmental and social risk management, human rights, as well as employment, labor relations, health and safety advice, and litigation. Michael has been extensively published and quoted in the media on sustainability and corporate social responsibility topics. He is the editor and lead author of IFC Performance Standards on Environmental and Social Sustainability, a guidebook published by LexisNexis in 2012. And Wesley Gee, he's the Director of Sustainability with the Works Design Communications Limited. He's been in that role since 2013, and prior to that, he was Senior Sustainability Consultant with Stantec for 3 years. And prior to that, Wes was the Senior CSR Advisor and Member Development Manager for CBSR, our organization. It's such a pleasure to collaborate with Wes, in part because, well, he's been a friend for the past 18 years, but also he knows our organization so well. And we're proud of alumni, quote unquote, like Wes, who have gone on to achieve so much, including starting his own successful business, lecturing and instructing at the University of Toronto at Ryerson, and influencing industry working groups, including the Global Reporting Initiative, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and the Conference Board of Canada. Wes is a real thought leader on sustainability reporting, and his wonderful team at The Works, which we're really proud to call a CBSR member, they do a great job of bringing reports to life. I'm now going to turn it over to Wes, and he and Michael will tag team the rest of this webinar. Wes, please take it away.
Great, thank you, Lior. So yeah, thank you so much for hosting this webinar. We're thrilled at the response that we've had from a lot of people in advance of the webinar. And also just a pleasure to be speaking alongside Michael from BMO, one of the companies that we've really enjoyed working with for several years now on their ESG reporting and broader initiatives as well. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to just mention a couple of things about our annual trends research. So, this is research that our firm has conducted for the past 7 years. We really initially did it just for us to stay in the know as far as what's happening with respect to sustainability or corporate social responsibility communications and reporting. And it's since really evolved to include a range of topics that we might commonly fit within the buckets of content, design, and interactivity. But as you can see here, it really covers a wide range of areas. And the research has involved companies across the globe, roughly around 110 or so companies from 12 different sectors. So, I mean, with that, we've learned a lot. We continue to learn a lot with the research, and we're very pleased to be able to share it with you and with our clients, really just as a way to help us all build the business case for doing better, smarter work within this space. And really to think about, rather than just this incremental improvement approach that can be rather comfortable, to think about how we might be able to do things in a bit more of a disruptive or in a more significant, meaningful way that really thinks about not just what's happening within your sector, but with companies on a broader scale. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do over the next little while is to be able to provide you just with a bit of a snapshot on what were some of the trends from some of these topics. We'll be bouncing back and forth with Michael as well, since Michael's had an absolutely critical role at BMO around their sustainability reporting, disclosure, and many other important areas. But this is really just to give you a bit of a taste as far as, you know, some of the things that we found to be more successful and would probably be of significant interest to those who are on this call. So the Sustainable Development Goals, I don't think they really need much of an introduction coming from the United Nations Global Compact. We've seen a really significant increase in the number of companies who are showing their alignment to the goals, their support of the goals. As you can see, a spike from 34% to 77% in the previous year. But really where we see things, I think where things are getting real would be for companies to actually show their alignment to particular targets. That's where you can see a genuine commitment that is being made to the goals by showing, for companies to be able to show how they're actually trying to meet those particular targets under what are some fairly broad goals. So if we go to the next slide here, it helps us see, you know, what that might look like. So if we're looking at AXA, this is an example of, you know, what many companies are doing to be able to show that they're aligned in some form or fashion to a subset of those goals, rather than treating it as a tick box exercise, to be able to show that when it comes down to it, there are 6 goals that AXA feels like it can make a considerable impact in addressing. So the illustration here kind of sums it up to show those goals and provides a bit of context around what they're doing with respect to each of those goals. If we go to the next slide, this would be an example of where things are getting real. So the example from AstraZeneca shares how they're aligned to a smaller number of goals. In this case, they're showing 2. They're aligned to more than 2, but you can see what, in this case, SDG 3 around good health and well-being. It shows a very quick description of why it matters, and it shows their progress towards meeting specific targets around that goal. Now, later on in the report, they do have some storytelling that, you know, helps weave it in, but this is a really succinct way of being able to show, you know, how they're taking this, how they're addressing the SDGs. If we move on to the next slide, the TCFD is something that might not be as familiar to people, but is certainly considerable interest to a lot of companies in Canada and elsewhere. So these are the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. This is something that particularly a lot of companies in the energy and industrial sector, those high industrial emitters, as well as financial service companies, are thinking about these recommendations and framing them in a way in their annual financial reports or in their sustainability reports to be able to show how well they are addressing climate change within their business, within risk management and governance, but also the extent to which they might even be able to think about these things from a, let's say, a scenario planning standpoint, to be able to understand the extent to which, for them to understand and to articulate how their business is expected to be affected by a 2-degree increase or otherwise. So what you can see here, this is the first year we've been tracking it. Roughly 30% of companies are responding to the TCFD recommendations, which is pretty significant. If we go to the next slide, we can show you kind of what that looks like. So this is a bit of a nerdy chart, but this is probably what you're going to see in a number of different companies that are addressing the TCFD. With ING, they're probably one of the top companies really in globally within this space in addressing issues around climate change. But you can see that there is a chart that shows the different elements, the 4 main elements of the TCFD, and it shows where you can find the answers to those questions that are being asked by the recommendations in the company's financial or sustainability or otherwise their disclosures. But also having a short piece that helps people understand what is the TCFD, why should it matter to a company like ING, and what is it planning on doing in the future. The next slide. From Bloomberg, this is where, of course, a company like Bloomberg, with Michael Bloomberg being in a leadership role at the TCFD, they have they've shown that sense of scenario analyses, and very few companies have disclosed this yet. In fact, a lot of companies are still really working on this, but they've shown at least their understanding of how their business would be affected by a 2-degree scenario or a limited mitigation scenario. Now, I think this is going to be really interesting to see, particularly if you can see these types of disclosures feeding into companies' integrated or annual financial reports. And I think we should expect to see more of that in the following year. Before we move on to the next section, I want to bring things over to Michael because, I know that certainly looking at areas like the Sustainable Development Goals, the TCFD are certainly top of mind to BMO. And can you tell us a little bit about what your guys' thinking, what BMO's thinking is around each of these and how you're addressing these or planning on addressing these?
Sure, Wes, and I just want to echo your thanks to the CBSR for putting on this session. I think it's great and very topical. SDG and TCFD expectations and emerging standards and topics are really becoming important, not only for disclosure, but for sustainability strategy. So maybe just taking one at a time. The SDGs, I've been really amazed at how often they are the focal point of investors that we talk to about what's important to them around our sustainability strategy. And so really the SDGs are more than just a framework for disclosure. They're not really like the GRI. They're really about what are the topics that should be part of your sustainability program and your strategy. And so the expectation, I think, is increasingly that those 17 SDGs are informing a company's strategy. And so I think for BMO, we've been grappling with the SDGs and considering how to integrate that into our sustainability program for the last couple of years. Our first year was really focused on aligning our sustainability program to the SDGs, and we identified several SDGs that had particular relevance for our business. And so our 2017 ESG report reflects that and has that discussion. And then for 2018, we've really focused about how to embed the SDGs in our sustainability strategy. And so an example of how that's being used to inform what we do is in the sustainable finance space. We've had a lot of activity around climate change and the way that capital flows will be influencing the global transition to a lower carbon economy. And so SDG 13 has certainly been informative of how we're planning our own sustainable finance program and to grow in that space and capture the opportunities that are emerging from it. And I think the reason why it's become a focal point is because of the fact that it's not just about risk management, it's also about capturing opportunities, because it gives you an idea of where regulators and where investors and markets are going and what's important to them. And so you can, by understanding them, try to identify opportunities that can be driven by your sustainability program. In terms of the TCFD, it's a different genesis, and I think it's a different focus. And it's, to me, the most interesting thing about the TCFDs from a disclosure perspective is the F in TCFD, that it's climate-related financial disclosure is what the TCFD was intended to affect. And so there's really two aspects of the disclosure that they talk about and the work that should be done to implement. One is about qualitative discussion around things like your governance, your risk management, your strategy around climate change. A lot of that isn't necessarily going to be new. It might require some additional disclosure, or it might require the bringing together of multiple types of disclosure that companies like BMO have made in the past. For example, we've disclosed for a number of years under the CDP. And so for 2018, we're going to try to bring together that kind of disclosure and other disclosure we've done in the MD&A and elsewhere into the framework of the TCFD. The other aspect of the TCFD is around quantitative analysis, and it's the 2-degree scenario analysis that Wes touched upon. And that is an exercise that goes beyond disclosure. It's really about doing an assessment of your exposure to risks associated with potential climate-related risks, such as new regulation or substitution of goods, or physical risks that could emerge depending on which scenario were to unfold. So a lower degree scenario would imply higher amounts of regulation, more substitution of goods, towards more renewable sources of energy, and a higher temperature scenario might entail more physical risks, even if it has lower transition risk. And so once you've done that analysis, then the million-dollar question becomes whether there's any material risks that have been identified. And then obviously, if there are, then that could be disclosed within your financial disclosure. So the real emphasis of the TCFD is trying to understand how climate change can affect financial risks for business and then to disclose to the market accordingly. And in
Yeah.
terms of what BMO's doing, I guess just to wrap it up, as I said, on the qualitative side, we're pulling together our disclosure to tie it into the TCFD recommendations. And we were a early supporter of the TCFD in January, and we're taking steps to implement scenario analysis within our own risk management program.
Thanks for that, Michael. I know that there have been a couple of quick questions in here, and I'll answer them briefly. You know, one of them was just, you know, what's the best source for 2-degree physical impact analysis in Canada? You know what, that's a question I've been asking to a lot of different folks, and I don't see a lot of consistency around it. I've heard some people just say that they're relying on IPCC. I've seen people refer to studies that are coming from the IEA, you know, like CAP, for instance, providing that kind of information. But, you know, I just can't help but to think there may be a little bit of, you know, of bias around that. And I know that there's a tool that's available by Bloomberg as well that's providing a lot of that kind of help, that support around risk, helping understand the risks and responding to those. And there was also the question around where is TCFD going? You know, I think that's remains to be seen. I think it's probably not going to be any more prescriptive in the near term, since they are wanting to get a significant uptick of people disclosing, or companies disclosing to these. But you know, there are a lot of initiatives going on right now, one and in particular that is bringing a lot of these organizations together, GRI, SASB, IRC, and others. And I think once we get to a place where this disclosure space is becoming a lot more consolidated, it'll probably make a lot of us, including reporting companies, rather happy about it. So let's just move on to the next section here. So, you know, integration is one of those areas that is of really growing interest. I can see with a lot of the clients who we're working with at the Works, but also on a broader stage. And integration can mean a few different things. It can be actually developing an integrated report that is called an annual report or an integrated report. Or I know with one of our clients, it's an annual NCSR report. But it might also mean just being able to make that clear communication around how sustainability is integrated within your business. So if we're touching on bucket number one, you know, we found that there's roughly around 30% of companies within our sample that produced an integrated report of some form or fashion. Not much of a change, but a bit of an uptick in terms of the number of companies aligning to the IIRC, which is a framework that's used for integrated reporting. So let's see what that looks like. Next slide. So a couple of examples of where we see real leading edge or you know, brilliance in the integrated reporting space of actually doing an integrated report. The integrated annual report and accounts from the Crown Estate does a really great job of being able to not only visualize but also quantify, you know, as they say, what is our approach, what we do, what we rely on, and the value we create. They've even gone so far as to create a methodology that they've shared publicly to help other companies do the same thing, to be able to help companies measure, manage, and improve their impact around those 6 capitals that are coming from the IRC. If we're moving on to the next slide, once again, our darlings at ING. This looks like a boring chart, and you know what? It probably kind of is. But the great thing about it is that this is making a very clear connection between what are the opportunities and risks to the company, and what are some of the topics that are considered material or priorities. Making that clear connection is something that's unique to see. Especially since with a lot of sustainability reports, they'll have that materiality analysis, a list of what their priorities are, but not always making that direct connection to opportunities and risks. And that can be the benefit of doing an integrated report, because it does force these disparate parts of a company to be able to work together to collectively determine what matters, what is important to our business, and what are the most important things for us to measure, manage, and improve, and then lastly, to be able to report. So, you know what, that's what this does. If we're moving on to the next slide, this is where we're talking about bucket number 2. So we found that roughly the same number of companies are describing their sustainability governance structure, so how sustainability is governed within their business. Roughly 80% of companies with a board level CSR or sustainability committee or executive. the next couple of slides are just going to show what are some additional important assets to consider when you're doing a sustainability report. So next slide touches on the example from Van City. So this is an integrated report, but this could apply very well to a sustainability report as well. They have letters from both the chair and the CEO to be able to articulate what matters most to the business. With the chair, it is focused very much on the priorities of its members and of external stakeholders. With the CEO, it is getting a bit more strategic and tactical about what the company is doing within house to be able to address those key needs and strengthen its house. The next slide. With Maple Leaf Foods, this is a fairly straightforward illustration, but what this does is it helps people understand when it comes to governance of sustainability, where is the key leadership around that, to what level are key issues or departments being involved, and to what level is that senior person being able to report to both the board and to the president and CEO. So there are some of the illustrations that are a bit more complex, and you know, that may make sense sometimes, but you know, this is just at least a way to be able to, in a fairly straightforward way, to show where there's leadership and accountability for sustainability within the organization. Next slide. And the example from BMO here, this shows this whole notion of a balanced scorecard. This is something that I'm finding to be more common and extremely useful for analysts, investors, and plenty of others to be able to understand that at the end of the day, while most companies are tracking, you know, 472 things, there are probably 12 or 15 things at the end of the day where the company wants to be able to say that, you know what, if we're improving in these areas, we're probably, you know, in the right direction as it relates to our ESG performance. So the example from BMO, you can see that there are 3 years of performance. In some cases, they've established targets for what they want to achieve between now and 2021, and just how they're moving along that journey. So, you know, before we get into the next section of topics and examples, I want to bring this back to Michael again. You know, Michael, can you tell us a little bit about BMO's thinking around, you know, or how it's considering the shift towards integration, or you know, what kind of conversations it might prompt some interest, or frankly some concern, or you know, within that space.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I've been having as many conversations as I can with people around this topic to try to get a sense of what the different stakeholder views are and some of the best practices. I read an interesting paper from Ernst & Young that I think was published around 2009 that sort of implied that by 2020, the majority of reporting would be integrated reporting. And obviously that's not going to be the case. It's still a fairly small number of companies that do true integrated reporting, and an even smaller number that closely follow frameworks like the IIRC. They haven't caught on for a number of reasons. But that being the case, when I do speak to knowledgeable people, from sustainability analysts to investors, there's a general view that integrated reporting is really the gold standard of reporting because it ties your sustainability program with your business objectives. And BMO has taken some steps towards that. We do, though, have two separate reports. We have an environmental, social, and governance report, and then we have our annual report. The annual report does make reference to sustainability-related information. In the white pages of our annual report, there's some discussion, including reference to some of the ESG scorecard. And then we also have a discussion within our management discussion and analysis section on environmental and social risk. So those are sort of, you know, initial forays into a more integrated type of reporting. One question I have is, if we were to move farther into that and let's say someday eliminate our ESG report, I think the caution would have to be that we get asked a lot of questions and we have a lot of stakeholder interest on the broader amount of information that we provide within the ESG report. That's not necessarily focused on financial materiality, but is following frameworks like the GRI that are considering stakeholder materiality, which is a very different creature. So I think you'd have to be quite creative in moving to full integration of still finding ways to put out information to the marketplace that are going to be relevant to how you get evaluated by analysts and what's important to your stakeholders. So there's likely to still be multiple sources of disclosure, even if you go that route. And as you mentioned, SASB is an example of a standard. They released their final recommendations just about a month ago. And they've been working for a number of years on building that up, where the goal there is to try to draw as clear as possible linkages between sustainability metrics and financial materiality. It's very early days, though, in trying to make those connections, and even studies that have looked at that are not, definitive in terms of the linkage in all cases. And I think at the present time, disclosure will likely go beyond what is strictly financially material. TCFD is another example where there's now this standard that's very influential that is essentially promoting an integrated reporting approach to climate-related disclosure. So again, I think there's a trend. How it evolves remains to be seen, and it's something that we're certainly looking at very closely.
Great, thanks for that. And it actually sends us on an unplanned segue to the next section here, I think, which is around smart reporting. So, this is where, and I mentioned a segue just because, when we're having a lot of conversations with companies around integrated reporting, and based on what we've learned from our annual research, we're seeing that, it isn't necessarily about companies doing that one single report that's going to answer everybody's questions, but it is developing that integrated suite. So there may be a beefed up annual report that provides more substantive details around non-financial issues, but at the same time, different people, and let's say even a growing audience of different people want to view things in different ways. So that's why the development of microsites, for instance, are becoming really common. But at the same time, the PDF is still going to be something that is more or less a mandatory thing for companies to do, just so that analysts, investors, and others can do those keyword searches, or maybe even non-humans like bots to be able to find the information that they're looking for. And it might also involve things like just a downloadable performance table, among other things. So, we found that nearly every company is producing a PDF report, and about a quarter of companies are producing a PDF report in microsite. And that's a bit of a misleading statistic, just because, while that's a fairly small number of companies doing a microsite, what other companies are doing as well is, when they are redesigning the report, to be able to make sure that their silo, or the section of the report on sustainability, is going to be substantive, and it's going to be a lot more organized and hopefully interactive, so that maybe that serves as their quote unquote microsite, a section of the report rather than a separate site on its own. So next slide. The example from Van City is really a great example of one where they still have the PDF as that lead document that has everything that people need to know. But the microsite is something where they've really put a lot of thought into who are their key audiences, or what are some of the things that, let's say, the masses want to see a bit more. So the microsite captures, or I should say, provides summaries of its performance. It includes a lot of the stories and challenges. It includes videos. And as you can see from the bottom here, it has different downloads for people to view things in different ways. If we're going to the next slide, this is what I was talking about in terms of a hub or a centralized place where people can find what they're looking for. So Barrick, what they've been doing for the past 2 years is to be able to have something they call a transparency hub. And what you can see here is that there's a combination of financial and sustainability related documents and disclosures that are all in one place. So it should make it fairly easy for people to find what they're looking for. So there are things like the annual financial report, the AIF, there is the GRI content index, but there are also topic specific reports around human rights and conflict-free gold, which are top of mind for a company like Barrick. But there's even a separately downloadable Excel document called the ESG performance data document. So, probably not something to be showing to your mom, or unless she is a sustainability analyst or investor, let's say. But just to give you a sense of the type of things that might be happening from an integration point of view. If we're moving on, video. It's an exciting space right now. And frankly, it's a space where companies are able to do more. They're able to invest more within this space because the costs of video are going down a bit more than what they used to be. And frankly, it's just being real about how do people want to be informed and engaged around what's going on as it pertains to sustainability or in other areas. So we could see that about a third of companies have reports that have video built into it. And around over 90% of companies have videos that include more than just that CEO headshot. So, you know, I'm just really excited about the type of things that are happening within the video space, though, because, you know, even through things like including open captions can really increase the amount of viewership engagement around these types of assets. But also in creating a level of interactivity can really help people understand issues a lot better, and to get them really interested in a company. So moving on to the next slide. The example from Annie here, so it includes a combination of videos and moving images. It basically has it alongside long-form storytelling, and it even includes audio. So, you know, to be able to think of it in terms of almost like a podcast, so that you can be able to view these things separately, and really just a way to help people understand why issues are important to different stakeholders. So, and another important point of this example of video is that this isn't just the company, any, talking about itself. We're talking about different issues. It's profiling people who are impacted by the company and, you know, the different relationships or partnerships that exist with Eni, which is an Italian oil and gas company. Moving on. So when we're looking at the next topic here, that is around engagement. So this is really companies being able to articulate who matters most to their business. How do they engage with them? What are some of the things that those groups care about? And what's the company doing to be able to address some of those priorities and concerns? So it may not be a big surprise to you all on the call, but you know, a very large number of companies are mentioning how they engage with these stakeholders. Roughly 80% are identifying the priorities of those stakeholders, and another really big spike of the number of companies identifying how they're addressing those priorities and concerns. This is really a great way of being able to, early on in the report, for companies to be able to show how they're engaging with others and why they're focusing on the topics that they are within the report. Next slide. So the example from BMO here, this is, I would call it, you know, a fairly straightforward chart, but it's one that is quite revealing as far as, you know, just very clearly showing who are the stakeholder groups, how they've engaged in those groups, and, you know, what are some of the key issues that are raised in that engagement. So it's a really great thing to be able to show early on to help substantiate the topics that are included later in the report. And the next slide here, also coming from BMO, I wanted to share this just because, you know, this is a way to be able to incorporate the things that we've learned from engagement. So this is an example of long-form storytelling that shows the partner organization to be able to talk about why the issue of financial literacy is important and the role that BMO has played in being able to address it in the region or regions around Chicago. So before I move on to the next section here, I wanted to bring it to Michael and just to be able to ask, you know, when it comes to stakeholder engagement, you know, what kind of approach are you guys taking at a corporate level versus regionally? And if there's really anything you want to say as far as, you know, what you feel like are effective ways for companies to be addressing engagement within their communication and reporting.
Mm-hmm. Well, stakeholder engagement, it really happens in a number of ways, and the excerpt that you showed was one exercise that we did to deliberately engage with a group of stakeholders, from investors to customers and employees and others, about what are the material sustainability topics that we should be disclosing on. And we did that in 2017, and then that developed some of the key topic areas that then guided what we disclosed. I mean, an interesting thing about that exercise, it was very, very useful and helped drive our focus areas in terms of our reporting, but it also didn't identify certain topics that I think would, you know, we would say are definitely relevant, like climate change, for example. So I think you can't just have a focus group or in-person types of stakeholder engagement alone. You have to have your ear to the ground and treat all of the types of interactions you have with sustainability professionals, with analysts, with investors, with NGOs that you're speaking with or get questions from, with questions that you get from the general public, and put that together as a web of issues that are pertinent to your business. And then you have to use your own business judgment then at that point to identify, what is really important to my business and what am I going to focus on in terms of building a sustainability program and in reporting. So for example, this year we're going to be adding some additional disclosure around two topics: climate change and human rights, that weren't identified in our stakeholder engagement exercise last year, but have certainly come to the fore in discussions that we've had with institutional investors and analysts and others. And our global asset management arm has been grappling with as well, from their vantage point as investors or asset managers engaging with companies globally. And from a corporate perspective, our engagement goes right up to the top. From I've been in meetings where we're engaging at very senior levels of the organization, or even with the board of directors, with some of our stakeholders. And I think that's good to be able to get those varying perspectives conveyed at the in appropriate circumstances, and also to allow these senior leaders to understand what kinds of topics are of interest to some of our core stakeholders. So this kind of engagement, I think, is critical for you to have situational awareness and to know what types of topics are most relevant. They should be guiding both your strategy and also your disclosure planning and strategy.
Thanks for that. So moving on to the next section here, around materiality. So, pretty good segue from engagement, since engagement is an important element in helping companies identify what is material. So we found that roughly the same amount, or over 90% of companies, are identifying their priorities. And a slight increase, but around 70% of companies are illustrating it using a matrix. So I'll just show you kind of what that looks like. The next slide. So I think a really unique example comes from Air France and KLM, because what they've done here is to be able to have an illustration to show that stakeholder map of, really who does matter most to their business. And being able to also share some methodology around how they engage with stakeholders, how they conducted a materiality assessment, showing that standard matrix, but also showing a different matrix around performance perception that compares what those priorities are to how different stakeholders believe the company is addressing those particular priorities. And then lastly, you have these individual illustrations that are showing what are the top 5 topics to particular stakeholder groups. So I think that, compared to just showing your standard materiality matrix, this adds a lot of valuable context so that people do understand that, there are some topics that are important to some groups more than others. And, maybe something like this could be done regionally rather than across sectors. Okay, so just moving on to the next example, just in the interest of time. When we're looking at storytelling, we did have that example of long form storytelling before, but themes is a really important component of that as well. And we're finding that there was a pretty significant increase in the number of companies that are following a theme, rather than calling it the 2018 sustainability report, that there's something that they can hold on to that really speaks to, who they are, what their purpose is, what they're trying to achieve. And, some of the best themes are the ones that do actually carry over for multiple years rather than, let's say a flavor of the year. So let's see what that looks like. Next slide. So Sanford, I would say this is probably one of the more unique and interesting ones that we saw. They're what they're calling the power of and. For a New Zealand seafood company, they do have a lot of challenges around being able to fish in a responsible way, but also being able to focus on the cost effectiveness of seafood and being able to be a competitor within their sector. So that kind of theme goes throughout the report, through the stories, through the narrative, and the leadership. I do certainly suggest, that they're a company maybe a lot of you haven't heard of, and certainly a really interesting integrated report to take a peek at. Next slide. And when we're looking at storytelling as well, I like the example of Newmont just because this is an example of what we would call a case study library. We want to make sure that when companies have developed case studies or stories within the reports and they're releasing a new report, then those old stories don't go to case study heaven. They go to a place where perhaps it's on the company's website or a microsite where those stories can continue to exist, where people might be able to do a search around particular topics or issues or regions to be able to see that, you know what, that story that is 2 years old, it probably isn't obsolete. Maybe it does involve some tweaks, but there's a way to be able to get greater utility out of those stories and to be able to share them on social. Next slide. So that brings us to a section around digital strategy. So this is a new area that we have investigated this year, one where we have certainly seen a lot of really interesting things going on in different companies as far as their use of social media. And as you can see here, a number of companies investing a lot of resources in the use of social media and doing them in a way that really considers the different type of social media, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, how they want to use that and how those things that they're sharing, whether they're static images, moving images, videos, etc., are taking people to your website to be able to learn more. So for moving on to the next slide here, Citi provides an excellent example of how they're being able to quickly do a bit of storytelling on Twitter using quick videos, static images on Facebook, and it's all bringing people towards the company's blog, which is where they'll be able to see that long-form storytelling video, etc. So it's really a way to be able to try to package things differently to different audiences based on how they want to be able to view that information. Next slide. With NL, this is a very unique example, and this is something that I've kind of pressed some of our clients on as well too. They've actually created competitions on social to be able to spur a certain level of innovation among people within their company and with external partners. They're presenting specific challenges that align to SDGs, but they're providing a financial reward for people to come up with the best idea to be able to tackle things that are genuinely important to the business. So, you know, that is a fascinating thing to see. We've seen lots of companies do innovation contests. This is something, another way of being able to do it on social and being very specific about what their needs, their priorities are. You know, that might be also an interesting way of being able to recruit future talent for a business. Next slide. And then finally, the use of LinkedIn influencers. So, you know, Mary Berry is a really great example of someone, you know, in a leadership role within General Motors, to be able to come up with their own pieces on LinkedIn, to be able to address key issues rather than it being something from a 30,000-foot level. This is something that is, you know, coming from her. It's addressing, you know, following the U.S.'s when they pulled out of the Paris Accord, for her and for General Motors to say that this is something where they are still all in on investing in climate change and being able to invest in their fleet to be able to focus on the challenge that is presented to them. So it's really exciting to see, and it's a way to really put a face to key people within the business. So I believe that that's the last example. Yes, I think so. So I just wanted to turn it over to Michael because I wanted to see if there were any other really key issues or areas that you wanted to touch on before we're getting into Q&A.
The only thing is there was one question that had come up on the chat box there about why in integrated reporting hadn't caught on. And I mean, it's, you know, there's probably many reasons, but I think one of the critical things is there's a need for investor relations and, you know, finance and sustainability to become integrated in their thinking. And so that is an important step that has to take place internally within an organization to understand what an integrated report should look like. And I think one of the things that has held that movement back has been competing definitions of materiality and perhaps confusion as to what is material for a report that is going to be investor facing. And obviously there's a focus on securities regulations in that respect. But what I've been witnessing over the last number of years, and I think increasingly in the last year or so, especially with the notice that was released by the Canadian securities regulator this year about climate-related disclosure, is I think that those kinds of issues are increasingly being dealt with and examined by regulators. They're of interest to investors. And the more that happens, I think the more there will be convergence on an understanding of what is really just material for stakeholders, including investors. And going back to what you said, Wes, there's a really important need to identify what's important for your business. And at the end of the day, the company itself that is putting out information to the marketplace should really own that and be the one that decides what is important for its business and decide how to develop its strategy and report accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, doing an integrated report is not an easy exercise. And in fact, the report just happens to be let's say, the manifestation of all the efforts that are happening within an organization. So to do this in a meaningful way, it does involve a lot of departments working together to decide what does matter most. What are some of the things that we are generally going to focus on, measure, and report? So, you know, I know firsthand that there are organizations that are doing this internally, but they're just not ready to do an integrated report yet because they're still, you know, kind of working on things internally. But I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to see more of this type of thinking, this type of planning, this type of reporting in the future.
Well, I'd like to jump back in here with the time remaining. I would like to thank you, Wesley and Michael, so much for all that really excellent information. And I hope that all of you listening enjoyed as much as I did the back and forth that these two had. And that was really appreciated, that you made space for each other to be able to have that informal conversation with a lot of great content as well. Thank you for that. We do have just a few minutes remaining, and we had some good questions in the chat box there. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, both Michael and Wes addressed a few of them already, but there's a couple of them that were still left hanging, and I thought I would just highlight them once again. And let's try and do it sort of kind of rapid fire style so that we can get a few more questions in there, because I have a couple of my own as well. But Wes, could you just answer quickly Catherine's question, which was really, what was your methodology in terms of how you chose the companies that you looked at and included in the slides that were presented on this webinar?
Yeah, so that wasn't very easy, but it's one where we looked at a lot of where there were report awards and recognition that was given out for companies who have won awards within the space. But more broadly, it was really important for us to make sure that we had a pretty good balance of companies across 12 different sectors that are based in different parts of the world, while also where we felt, you know, it made sense to be able to include a few of our clients within the mix as well. You know, some of the companies that are doing things in a more considerable way, like a BMO or a Maple Leaf Foods or a Newmont Goldcorp or someone like that. It did involve us looking at a lot of different reports, being able to filter through them, and then coming up with that hard choice. And to answer the second question around the big spike in numbers, our sample does change every year. So I would say roughly around 50 to 60% of the companies remain, but that other 40% is, so, you know, those are different companies. So I think if I was a master's student, I probably would get dinged on my research methodology. You know, that explains in some cases where there was a more dramatic spike.
Thank you. And a question for both of you, gents here. Lisa, who knows this stuff quite well herself, she asked, what's the best source of potential 2-degree physical impact analysis for Canada specifically? Either of you have thoughts on that? I
mean, I would say, I think it's I don't think there are a lot of great sources from what I know right now. I mean, that's a question we're asking ourselves. I know that there's some research being done, I think, by the U of T, and the Ontario government for a time was looking at developing an institute that would focus on those kinds of questions. Wes had noted that I think Bloomberg has some tools available. I'm not sure what the coverage is exactly in Canada, but I think it's one of those areas, you know, like a lot of the things with the TCFD, that there needs to be a lot more work done. And I think it's difficult to extrapolate from international models and assumptions on these sorts of things, to apply it to a Canadian context in a blanket way. So there is work that needs to be done and is being done to try to create some of those tools to allow for a better type of analysis of physical risk assessment.
Yeah, that's really one of the things that I'm so critical of. Like if companies are putting together a TCFD submission to be able to show the data that they're showing to support it, or the research supporting it, like if that isn't coming from a reliable source, then it kind of throws everything else into question. So, you know, it would be great if there is a bit more of a centralized area, or something that we can all agree is reliable with respect to Canada, rather than, you know, something that is just a global resource, for instance, particularly for companies in Canada that are based mainly here.
One thing I would add, though, is that I think, you know, in certain industries, there are already models and catastrophic scenario analysis that's being done. You know, we do that, for example, as a bank, and then we have a reinsurance business that does that kind of analysis. And I know many insurance companies are looking at these kinds of questions. So there's probably a lot of privately held models and ways of analyzing these sorts of problems. But I think there is, especially with the TCFD, a need for more publicly available consensus types of resources for this. And so that's more of the work in progress.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I was hoping to squeeze in a couple more questions, but I think that just in the interest of time, we'll end it there. Let's leave the chat box open a little bit for 5 minutes afterwards as well. And if anybody wants to add a couple more questions, I'd love to invite you, Michael and Wes, if you have a bit more time, just to stick around and answer those. So yeah, those who are listening, please do jot down a few more. But let me take the last couple of minutes remaining to just thank you both once again. You've been listening to Michael Torrence, Chief Sustainability Officer and General Counsel at BMO Financial Group, and Wes Gee, Director of Sustainability at the Works Design Communications. And thanks so much for all of you for tuning in today. If you wanted to hear any more sections again, or you want to share this with your colleague, please do so, because we're going to have a recording of this webinar available on our website, cbsr.ca. Just click on our work and then webinars, and you'll see, you'll be able to find this from the drop-down menu. If you, also you can join us again next month on December 11th, when our next webinar will be essentially an unveiling of our new national Do Business Like a Canadian campaign. And we look forward to sharing that information with you. And if you haven't done so already, please do subscribe to our newsletter so you can be among the first to hear about when we have more newsletters. Thank you very much for all of you, and especially to the speakers.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you very much.